everyone, and welcome to the Ashoka U Exchange. Ashoka is hosting this event, and we will be recording it. We may also use clips, images, recordings, quotes, and other parts of the recording in Ashoka publication and share via social media. If you do not wish to be recorded, please turn off your camera and ask questions via the chat window. We will post additional information about the recording and consents in the chat box. If you have any other concerns, please type your question directly to me in the chat box. And without further ado, I turn it over to Jill. Thank you.
Well, thank you and good morning. I'm gonna go ahead and walk us through slides here, which is not necessarily my usual way of presenting, but I thought we'd do it for this. I was looking forward to sharing you with just a little bit about a book that's coming out, Substantial Classrooms, Redesigning the Substitute Teaching Experience. And this morning I'm going to talk you through, it's really a mix. It's a book which is also the story of an organization. So let's see, we'll go ahead with slides. So Substantial Classrooms is a national nonprofit, and we have been in existence for about 5 years now. It started as the result of I spent a year as a fellow at Stanford at the D School, and had been motivated by a frequent experience I was having running another nonprofit organization where principals and other classroom teachers kept coming up to me and asking if they could borrow their Playworks staff person to serve as a sub. And it led me to sort of do some research into substitute teaching, and then spend a year really through design looking at what was possible. What we realized and learned was that subs were in this impossible situation, and that the structure itself wasn't serving anyone, and that while that was true, at the same time, we were also seeing that there were subs who were, despite the odds, having these really extraordinary experiences and becoming teachers or serving in other roles that were actually having this huge outsized impact on schools. And so I think one of my experiences as an Ashoka Fellow and sort of an insight that I've had sort of a 30-year career in social entrepreneurship is this understanding that there are these occasional like levers that if you can tweak this one thing, it has an outsized impact on the whole larger system. Subs felt like that it went the deeper I dug into the issue. And then, I will talk a little bit more about the impact of the pandemic, but what we've seen over the last year is that actually more than ever, subs are an essential part, and figuring out how to do it well is going to be key. So wrote this book, wrote the book almost more than a year ago, and it was scheduled to be published this past summer. And in the heart of the summer, I was like, you know what? This is a terrible time to publish a book about substitute teaching. No one is thinking about substitute teaching right now in the summer of 2020. But we postponed it, and it's now coming out April 13th, which I think is a much better time, because what people, as schools are reopening, and particularly with all the teachers who are understandably reticent about going back to school, the need for subs is greater than it's ever been. And so we're hoping that the stories and the insights in the book will be particularly relevant. So what I wanted to go through today, I think we are 4. So right now we could just do it we were going to break out, but I think we'll just do some quick intros if Nadine and Michelle, if you're up for it. And I see that we've had a couple of people join. So, and then I'll talk through themes, and then we'll do some question and answer at the end, and we'll go from there. So what I wanted to ask about was, I'd be interested if those of you who are on the call, if you have any memorable experiences with a sub, either as a parent or as a kid, or if you've worked in education, any sub, do you have a memory of a sub? And so if you're up for coming off mute and just introducing yourself, and just a brief, we can do it 2 minutes would be great. Cool?
Sure, I can start. Is that all right?
Go for it.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Nadine. I am on our Ashoka US and Globalizer teams. I'm calling it from Peru, by the way. And I clearly remember substitutes. Um, I always wanted to be a teacher, so I have a lot of like empathy for teachers. And I remember substitutes coming in and feeling like, you know, deer with the headlights in the headlights kind of thing. Really nervous, really kind of, you know, just feeling awkward being there, kids not listening, you know, just awful, awful situation. And me like shrinking in my seat, feeling so bad for these people in front of the room. And yeah, those are my biggest memories. And obviously not necessarily learning much because the rest of the kids were so unruly and they were just, the poorest substitute teacher was really, really lost.
Yeah.
Nice. So okay, so I just like share a member. So my name's Michelle. I work for Ashoka, but I was trying to think, am I supposed to put like if I've been involved in education? I thought I heard that question.
I was more just if share the context of your memory. If it was from being in
Oh,
education, yeah.
So I've been a substitute teacher and
Oh, wow.
yes. It's almost like a war zone a little bit when it comes.
I didn't mean to tap any PTSD here with you, but yes.
Yeah, I'm just like, no, kids, I promise I'm fun. But it is great. I really did love my time in the classroom. But then also, I think like substitute teachers always, like my feeling is always just like, ooh, it's going to be a fun day. Cause I just imagine that like, oh, are we going to get to watch a movie? Like what the deal's going to be. But I think for sure it's definitely for me, like I love this idea of this chat because it's like I'm sure we could have all done better as substitute teachers and being more formidable.
Well, and it's funny too, like it's such an interesting context as like as a mom or as a like so I like remember my kids coming home with subs and not that they would describe these situations where they like and whether or not they were actually fully taking responsibility for their own roles, but they would like describe other kids being super mean to the subs. And it's just a wild construct that we've set up any part of a kid's life where the social norm, like the expectation is that we will like somehow not only be disrespectful, but like do these people dirty. Like it's in a full on, like it's a built out, it's got all the narratives and like, and then you think about like the way it shows up in social media, like Jack Black in the school, you know, and he's basically just getting up off the couch to be a sub to like, you know, I think the implication is to buy another dime bag. You know, I think it's not a pretty sight. Or like, and if you've seen the Key and Peele, there's hysterical Key and Peele where he's the sub and he's mispronouncing the kids. I mean, it's the whole thing. It's very, but it's a source of disdain and ickiness that's pretty intense. So, well, thank you for sharing. Uh, so when you like dig into subs, so my this experience I had that I kept having recurring moments with principals and people saying, "Can you help with the sub? Can you provide a? Can we borrow our Playworks coach to be a sub?" Um, the more I dug in, the more sort of shocked I was by like the numbers, right? That at any moment in time, it turns out 10% of the teachers standing in front of American classrooms are subs. Like, so it's fully a year of a kid's K-12 education. And these are pre-pandemic numbers, right? So roughly across the, you know, the country, they're looking for 250,000 subs every day. And the fill rates are pretty terrifying, right? That for every 100 subs that are needed, we're usually coming up with about 80, which means that schools are scrambling to either ask their reading specialist to fill in, or they are figuring out how to like farm the kids out to different classrooms. So the implication is that it has a much bigger impact, not just on what's happening in the class where the kid or the teacher is absent, but also the other adjacent classes get impacted as well. Um, and then you'll see that patterns really they vary dramatically across the country with schools that are low income schools disproportionately have a harder time attracting subs and maintaining subs. And the other thing that sort of really intense is that 90% of the districts offer 4 hours or less of training total to send somebody into a classroom to be a sub. And most of that 4-hour training is super focused around kind of litigation kind of stuff, like this is how you don't do this, don't do that, and this is how you fill out your timesheet kind of stuff. So it's pretty grim. So when we started looking at how to sort of address the issue, I think this is interesting, and actually it's fun that Nadine's on it, because I've been doing work with Nadine around systems change and thinking, and the process for us was, one, sort of understanding the current state of subs, then two, thinking about improvements, but then shifting from improvements, and I'll talk a little more about the improvements, but just sort of foreshadowing, we went from improvements to sort of thinking about how might we, if we were starting from the very beginning, totally redesign the system, and ultimately how that sort of leads to more of a systems change mindset. So I just think that arc's sort of an interesting thing in terms of, and the book itself, I'll say, really, in writing the book, we've tried to show both the role of human-centered design in kind of digging into these kind of big, audacious challenges, but also to think about how to shift from a mindset where we're doing improvement, which is really important. Improvement is good. I'm pro improvement, but ultimately, what might it spark in terms of thinking more systemically about how you change things? Because one of the sort of insights we had along the way is that if you're always kind of jumping to sort of the problem solving without spending the time defining the system and defining the problem, and really starting with empathy and digging in that way, we often, I think, contribute to sort of maintaining the problem by not really doing that initial work. So the big sort of insight on the improvement front, when we started talking with school leaders and stuff and HR folks at the district, was they were always focused on how do we get more subs. But when we dug into the numbers, it turned out that over half of the subs showed up after they'd gone through all the rigmarole of taking the test and getting approved and signing up. Over 50% only subbed actually 3 days before they threw up their hands and said, oh, no. They had the sort of Michelle experience of like, this is overwhelming. So one of the key things we started to work with schools was like, stop thinking about how to recruit new people, but really focus on what might you do to get subs to come back. And not surprisingly, the sort of insight that we got the more we interviewed folks was that relationships were at the heart of making things work. There was one great sort of positive deviant, sort of a bright spot that we found. There was a school secretary in one of the schools here in Richmond, California, in a district where they had a really challenging time getting subs, and where 100% of the kids free and reduced lunch, so all these things that are associated with having a hard time getting subs, they had 100% fill rate. They always had subs. And we dug in a little deeper, and what we learned is, in fact, the school secretary was sending out thank you notes to everybody who came to sub, like this very simple little but she had built relationships with people, and the subs knew her and cared about her. And so when she would ask, could you come in? They would come in. So it was really a different thing. So that insight that school practices matter, what you do and how you treat the subs and how you're set up to welcome them and receive them and get their feedback, really just changes the game. And then finally, this sort of insight that if you focus on schools where you need, where the fill rate is the lowest, you can actually just have the greatest impact. We went from there to the shift that I mentioned to sort of how might we reimagine how substitute teaching works, and we go into this sort of insight in the book, shifting it from how do you get more subs to just a totally turning the whole issue on its head with changing the the frame of how you think about about the challenge, but what would you do if you had 10% more student time? Student time is such it's such an interesting, I often compare it to sort of water in the educational ecosystem. It feels like if you're a teacher that there's this abundance of student time, but it is when we start but it is, I think, the most precious resource that we have in an educational system. And when we start to not treat it with all the respect it deserves, it becomes a huge challenge, and you recognize how its lack of being held as precious ultimately degrades the whole ecosystem. And I think water is a very similar thing. Like, it sometimes feels like there's so much water, and yet when we don't treat our water as this precious resource, the whole system suffers. Um, and so then the design approach we went from there is to then really lean in to thinking about how you bring human-centered design to really address what was going on. So starting with empathy, finding inspiration in real people, thinking really small, like what are small tweaks or hacks that we could just put in place, and then testing and then retesting. And then really, it was interesting how the point when we were working with all these partners out in the schools, sharing our journey with the schools was absolutely critical to figuring out how to both bring them along. But the more we told the stories we were hearing, and the more we shared the journey of building out the different products that we built for Substantial, the more momentum we built. And that was ultimately the inspiration for writing the book, ultimately. I would say too, I just want to acknowledge, because I think it's relevant to a lot of the work folks are doing and think issues that folks are considering throughout Ashoka and Ashoka U, that when you start to do kind of systems change work on legacy systems, it's harder in some ways, because people are employed by it. Like the system, it works for some people, right? And like, I think that insight and how you keep and how you do that in a way that is respectful and brings people along. And I do think that the key to that, especially in legacy systems change work, is around empathy and really empowering the people who are part of the system to be integral to the change work itself. One of the projects I was working on over the past year was around identifying change in electoral systems. And so just trying to figure out how, oops, did I go back to it? Let me go back. Figuring out how to work with folks working in elections. And they were not at all thrilled when the idea was that you were coming in to tell them how to run their elections differently. But when you came in and asked them, what are your ideas about how to innovate, their receptivity to change was much greater. Oops, going forward. So in the book itself, we do go through a number of different opportunities, and innovators really go through and identify bright spots, which again just has served us super well, I think, and was a great inspiration. And I think for this kind of work, looking at that can really help. So the different opportunities and the innovators, the sort of social entrepreneurs in the field, and in some ways, I guess really they're more social entrepreneurs. They were working within the system to make these kind of changes. We go through all of those in the book. I would say then that in terms of the pandemic, what we're seeing as schools are reopening, a number of the ideas feel especially relevant, and they're called out in the book. Full-time school-based subs, which I think begins to address how you avoid the sort of change that happens. Sort of the transmission that happens. It's sort of an ironic upside that we were pushing for full-time school-based subs because it built relationships. It turns out now that fear of spreading COVID actually encourages that, so that's awesome. Because so many teachers are leaving the field, there's a growing recognition that subs is a potential pipeline that really needs to be sort of and is possibly better sort of developed and cultivated. And there's just been a lot of interest in leaning into existing relationships, folks who are already present at schools, whether that's after school folks or family members, parents, other folks who are looking for second jobs who are now interested. I was going to do an activity, but I think given just the size of our scale, we'll just wrap up. The keys in the book that I think that were exciting and relevant to everything going on in the world right now is that great things are already happening. There are people behind these ideas, and the more we can make that kind of connection, the better we are. And finally, that besides looking for bright spots, which is sort of also number two, it's not linear. I think the story that we tell in the book and the experience of running Substantial, the organization, has been, I think, like most things, that success is predicated on a series of failed efforts, and not losing your sense of humor and being willing to try things and make mistakes and do it visibly so that others can offer feedback and be part of the journey makes all the difference in the world. So the book tells the story. We're super excited to get it out in the world. I'm hoping that it'll be something that's picked up a lot by universities that are teaching social entrepreneurship as well as human-centered design, because I think it really does change the way we travel through this whole journey. So that's what I got.
Can I ask a question?
For sure.
So it's really interesting. I think you're talking around like, how do you shift really the management really around substitute teaching and like what it represents?
Yeah.
Do you think that this is really something that institutions need to lean in more, or would you say that like it's about like the agency of substitute teaching, like from the training perspective?
Yeah.
Like, where do you think the most responsibility sits?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a fascinating question, and we talk a fair bit about that in the book. One of the sort of structural challenges that we sort of call out about the way substitute teaching is currently configured is this sort of the reality of the missing manager. Like, it's a weird job in that you get hired, and HR brings you on usually at the district level, but then no one is in charge of like making sure that you have what you need, or that you're getting training or support or creating a community of practice. Like, and it's one of those structural design things, I think, where the pain point is felt most intensely at the school level, but they have almost the least amount of control over the hiring and the management of the subs. What you do see, and I think part of what exacerbates this as an equity issue, is that more affluent schools actually sort of do create workarounds where they figure out, they get their choice subs, they like figure out how to play the system so they can make sure that their people get filled into the slots, where other schools where they're dealing with, they have more issues that they're dealing with because of the sort of violence inherent in poverty. They then are they don't have the bandwidth or to sort of create those networks, and so it becomes a vicious cycle in those situations. So what ends up happening is that it is incumbent upon the subs to be self-motivated, but ultimately, I think what we're suggesting is that that for the system to be sort of reimagined, understanding it not just as a stopgap measure for sort of teacher absence, but seeing these humans who are coming into our schools and making these potentially major contributions, seeing them as a key resource, it makes a big difference. I will say another thing that's been sort of interesting to look at working nationally on this issue is that it's not a huge practice in California, but outside of California, lots and lots of states outsource their subs. They use various essentially temp agencies like Kelly. It used to be Kelly Girls is the single biggest recruiter of subs in the country, and I think it's an interesting question, like, and there have been some sort of startups. There's Swing Education has started, which is a sort of more of a they've got more of a social impact lens, and they are trying to bring innovation. It raises this really interesting question, though, on public versus private goods, and as someone who's started various businesses, I think you outsource some things. Like that's often a wise business decision. I would offer, though, that in terms of education, hiring teachers should be a core capacity of our school districts. And so outsourcing things which are so critical. She said, trying not to be super critical of how they're doing it. I mean, that is the other lens, right? You don't want to come into a system and try and change it by telling them, wow, this is so dumb the way you're doing it. Like, not super good way to win people over. But it does raise questions.
No, thank you. That really answers because the one thing I will just follow up with, I think about even when you're talking about the position of schools and connecting like that training and who comes to the school, you would totally think that there would be a stronger relationship with that pipeline, especially with the exposure to students.
Yeah.
Even you saying like, I totally forgot that substitute teachers kind of get placed however they're placed in like a broader region or county, whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, that is not the greatest way to approach like consistency.
No, and it's interesting too, because like with custodians and school bus drivers and school secretaries, they use the sub lists as their hiring pools. Like that's a normal practice. But somehow, and it gets back to that question we started with at the very beginning about the sort of the cultural narrative about subs and the sort of disdain. I think the language piece is really interesting. I read about this a little bit about like, as a mom, I know that my kids need other grown-ups in their life for them to be happy and whole humans. And now my kids are actually mostly grown-ups, but in general, when they were littler kids. But if you'd referred to those other adults as substitute moms, I would have been a little bent out of shape. And I think, and I think it's weird that we call, like in no other group of humans, when they're absent, do they have someone come in to be a sub for them, right? I'm sure there's, sexism layered on tops of all sorts of other things that at the heart of it, but like, it's just a very weird, like the language, I think, is super off-putting for educators. I think the concept of a long-term sub, which is now a huge like reality, like it's a little jumbo shrimpy, like which one are you, long-term or sub? And so I think all that really comes into play.
Thank you.
And Jill, I missed your session, but I did want to come in because I really love this topic. Is our school system for my daughter, they have these kind of consistent subs in the elementary level, but then, you tend to see similar people. But in the middle school, they don't bother. If the teacher's sick, they just send you to these other classrooms, and then you have your laptop and you do your own work. And it's the most failed model. Yeah. And then in one teacher, in particular, she was sick a lot. And so her children were sick. So then she was sick a lot. So when you're missing 20% of the days, 20% of those classes are never taught. And it's all by the computer. And for me, like all I kept thinking was, it's just the school system's trying to save money. Well, then we don't have to, if we just, disperse them into other classes. But the value of a sub is to add value to the classroom. How hard is it to come in 20 minutes early and read what you're going to teach? Hopefully it's not too complex,
Well, yeah, I think that's totally, like structurally, the way the money flows is, I think, super telling, right? And so schools are often very much disincented from solving their own problem, right? Because if you carry a sub as a school-based personnel, then it comes on your budget as a school. Whereas if you rely on the district, it's on the district's budget, right? So it's just something as simple as like, structure. I think as all sorts of issues are being unpacked during this moment in our societal reality, you do see that things happen by design. And not that people are like necessarily intentionally or consciously like trying to prevent there being subs, but like there are reasons that things stick the way they do and they last the way as long as they do. And I think well, who does this privilege? How does it work? Why are we not paying attention to it? What are the disincentives? What are the incentives? Where are the decision levers held? I mean, one of the things I just really love about this issue is, besides solving this issue, it feels so emblematic of all these other kinds of different system change questions.
Mhm. Yeah. And I love that you wrote the book and that you're starting this because it's a new organization you started, right?
Well, I started it 5 years ago.
Oh,
I don't, no, it's, and I actually, it's interesting. I've now founded 3 different organizations, and this third time, I really sort of am the board chair that I kind of would have always wanted. So I help raise a lot of money, but my co-founder is the managing director, and so we wrote the book together. But I'm not involved really in the day to day. So. But it's an interesting journey.
yeah. It's so needed in public schools that there has to be a higher advocate for these flaws in our system that no one bothers to fix. It's
Yeah.
just,
But it's so funny too, though, because I feel like I've had all these conversations over the year, and then throughout the book, there are all these interviews, right? But you meet with superintendents, and like just had one really like sort of, it felt sort of this one sort of conversation I had with a superintendent very early on in my research. And he basically, I get into the meeting and he says, look, Jill, I only agreed to meet with you about this because of Playworks. And you've been so amazing with
because I
recess in our
trust you.
school. Right. So, well, and he said, and I want to be really clear. I try to avoid thinking about substitute teaching in our district as much as humanly possible. Like it's depressing. It's like, it's thoroughly broken, and it's not on anybody's priority list. And I just am like, I only took this meeting because it's you and you asked. And I was like, great. And like, I started talking about what we were thinking and what we were trying. So like our first product was creating an online sub plan sort of app, which,
Yeah.
you were saying about Debbie, about how hard is it to get there 20 minutes early and look over the plan, but like half the time subs will get there and there is no plan.
I know,
So,
right, exactly.
right. So that's crazy making, right? And before you blame anybody, right? If you're a teacher and you've created plans and either that you didn't get a sub, or you didn't get a sub, or they didn't follow the plan, it disincentivizes leaving a plan, right? So there's this whole vicious cycle. But the favorite insight, though, is that the number one human who really cares about there being a sub plan available is the school secretary. And so, which took us a while to figure out, because
Makes sense.
it does, though. They're the humans in the morning when the subs are arriving and they're getting the plans to the people, and and if they're not subs, if the sub doesn't show up or whatever, they're the one calling to find emergency there, or figuring out if the reading specialist can cover, or how you're going to spread the kids out. They are the ones that this chaos disproportionately affects. So that whole thing about figuring out who is the user, the most motivated user of this system, and how might we understand their needs and appeal to and try and make their lives better and get that buy-in. And I just think that was so revelatory. Anyway, as I was describing all this to the superintendent, and just some simple tweaks about what we were saying, and I told the story earlier about the value of sending out thank you notes, or just these different things that the people could do. And the soup is like, all right, I'm surprised I'm saying this, but I am willing to try a few, you've convinced me that there are a few things that we might change, and instead of constantly trying to figure out how do we get more subs, just the reframing of the challenge.
And plus, Jill, you did a really important part about explaining that we need to have this contact person that's going to do this. And then the schools, let's have 5 lectures already done, pre-planned for subs. And then it doesn't have to fit in that week. It's just, here's 5 things I'd love to teach, but I don't have time, or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and that's been fun. That's one of the things that sort of popped up, is the possibility of innovation in that way. And so we've had great partnerships with other actually Ashoka fellows. what is your innovation and how might you think about the extra time that is represented, the 10% of student time that's underutilized in schools, to actually have that be sort of a resource for you achieving your mission. So one of the stories in the book is about a guy who runs this really amazing after school youth sports mentoring program, recruiting African-American males, college students who then coach high school students who work with younger kids, this whole cascading leadership model, and getting those college students to consider being subs. Because and if you're a college student being a sub, right, it's $100 a day, which isn't nearly enough to do it as a grown person living in most of the urban areas. But as a college student, it's, it's one day every couple of weeks. That's book money, and it's interesting how and what they can do and who they might be for the students is just a very different. Showing up as a man of color, as a sub who's currently in college, and the messages and the nature of that interaction it's just a very different sub experience than what we initially sort of imagine.
Yeah,
I like what you said about the innovation side of things. Is so somebody teaches empathy and they have a whole curriculum they have on empathy.
Yeah.
So there's a video series they have. Okay, so we're going to do empathy today in these 5 classes. Who's going to come in that day and just hit the video and here's the activities?
Yeah.
So maybe the sub doesn't have to do anything. They're facilitating really great content that we've curated by Ashoka fellows.
Although I would say, though, being a really talented ed tech facilitator is actually far more challenging than any of us acknowledge. So
you're totally right there.
Joke. But I was also going to say, like, even thinking about it from the college experience, it's like if you have a poor experience being a substitute teacher, it could totally turn someone off from wanting to be an educator as like a
right.
Well, substitute teachers are like the last people thought about, although they're pretty critical. It's like why can't we think a little bit deeper about how we treat them and bring them in?
Well, and Michelle, that's exactly right. So one of the stories we tell is we actually ran a pilot in conjunction with UC Berkeley, where we recruited college students. We actually hired someone on campus and she recruited her peers, and they functioned as a cohort throughout the semester, and they went through the whole process of becoming subs, and we gave them some classroom management training and this whole thing. And then we took them in to a couple of schools that we were particularly partnering with to do a visit and to actually, and the principal took them around and introduced them to people and showed them where things were and did all this stuff and to make them feel welcome, right? Because they're 20, 21 years old and they were going to be guests in their school and because they were college students, somehow the principal knew that they would need this kind of an orientation. And in the middle of the orientation, that first one, she turned to me and said, it occurs to me that anybody who was coming into our school to function in this role would need an orientation like this. And we've never done that. And so they started doing sub tours in general. Sub tours, in fact, is a great sort of easy thing to do to recruit folks to be subs in your school. It's sending, not only is it giving people valuable information about where you park and pee and how lunch works, which essential human things, right? It also sends the very explicit message that you matter and we care about you and we are going to try and take care of you.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Jill.